The DNA is telling us. So doing the Y chromosome work, I found that there wasn't a link between Richard III and the male line relatives who are alive today.
The DNA from King Richard III's bones is telling us a story that history books have kept silent for centuries. It's a tale of a shocking family secret hidden deep within the royal bloodline. We're not just talking about the famous mystery of the princes in the tower. You see, the genetic analysis revealed something far more fundamental, a discovery that suggests a massive deception at the heart of the English monarchy. The thing nobody tells you is that the right to rule was based on blood, and Richard's blood tells a very different and much darker story. A royal grave desecrated. For more than 500 years, the final resting place of Richard III was a complete mystery. The history books told of his end at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the last major clash of the brutal Wars of the Roses. Accounts said his body was taken to Leicester and buried without ceremony at the Greyfriars Friary. But as centuries passed, the friary was torn down and the memory of its exact location faded into pure legend. To put it mildly, the king's grave was thought to be lost forever, with some rumors even suggesting his bones were dug up and tossed into a river. That all changed in 2012 when a team of archaeologists began a dig in a most unlikely place, a city council car park in Leicester. Historical maps suggested the old friary once stood right there, its foundations hidden beneath layers of asphalt. Few people expected to find anything, let alone the remains of a long-lost English king. But then the impossible happened. Within days of digging, they uncovered a human skeleton. What many overlooked at first was its location, in the area believed to be the friary's choir, precisely where historical records said Richard III was laid to rest. The skeleton, at first called simply Skeleton 1, had features that immediately grabbed everyone's attention. It belonged to a man in his early 30s. Richard III was 32 when he passed away on the battlefield. The bones were covered in the scars of combat. There were at least 10 distinct injuries, including 8 on the skull, consistent with vicious blows from swords or halberds. The most shocking fact is, some of these cuts suggested his helmet had been ripped off in his final moments. This matched the gruesome contemporary accounts of his violent end. But the most telling clue of all was the spine. The skeleton had a severe case of scoliosis, a dramatic S-shaped curve that would have caused one shoulder to sit much higher than the other. Chroniclers from Richard's time described him as having uneven shoulders, a feature that William Shakespeare later exaggerated into the grotesque image of a villainous hunchback. The bones revealed the truth. While he wasn't the monster from the plays, he did have a significant physical condition that would have been impossible to hide. You can see this everywhere in historical propaganda, but here was the physical proof. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains squarely in the late 15th century. Even more amazing, chemical tests on the teeth revealed a diet fit for a king, full of expensive meat and seafood. Everything seemed to fit, but it wasn't enough. For history to officially accept that this was Richard III, they needed undeniable proof. They needed something stronger than bones and historical accounts. They needed DNA. The thing nobody tells you is that finding a genetic link after 500 years is almost impossible. The challenge was set. Connect this ancient skeleton to living relatives and finally solve one of history's greatest missing person cases. The bones told a fascinating story, but only DNA could reveal the shocking truth. A royal scandal exposed. With the skeleton of a potential king on their hands, all eyes turned to the science lab. The archaeological evidence was strong, but the world demanded certainty. The big question was, could DNA pulled from bones buried for over 5 centuries truly prove this was Richard III? The task was, to put it mildly, immense. Ancient DNA is incredibly fragile and can easily be ruined by modern contamination. But if it worked, the payoff would be historic. Scientists focused on 2 special types of DNA that passed down through generations almost unchanged: mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and the Y chromosome. First, the mitochondrial DNA. This is passed down only from a mother to her children. This means you, your siblings, and your mother all share the same mitochondrial DNA. Genealogists performed a miracle of historical detective work, tracing Richard III's family tree through his sister, Anne of York. They followed an unbroken female line for 19 generations, across 500 years, and found two living descendants, a furniture maker in London named Michael Ibsen and a Canadian researcher named Wendy Doldig. They were Richard III's great-nieces, 16 times removed. When the lab results came back, it was a perfect match. The mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton was identical to that of Michael and Wendy. The odds of this being a coincidence were astronomical. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. In February 2013, the University of Leicester officially announced that the remains were, beyond any reasonable doubt, those of King Richard III. Case closed, right? Not even close. You see, the mitochondrial DNA was just one half of the story. The other half would unleash a scandal that no one saw coming. Next, scientists looked at the Y chromosome, which is passed down exclusively from father to son. In theory, Richard III's Y chromosome should match that of other men descended from the male Plantagenet line. Researchers traced this line back to Edward III and found living male line relatives, primarily from the Somerset family. They took their DNA samples, ran the tests, and got ready to add the final piece of confirmation. But the results were a complete shock. There was no match. The Y chromosome from King Richard III's skeleton did not match the Y chromosome of his supposed living male relatives. Instead of confirming his identity, the test exposed a massive secret hidden in the royal family tree. This meant that somewhere in the 19 generations separating Richard III from his relatives, there had been what scientists politely call a false paternity event. In plain English, someone's official father was not their biological father. A royal affair, a secret child, a broken bloodline, the implications were explosive. What many overlooked is that this wasn't just about some distant ancestor. This secret could undermine the legitimacy of the entire royal line. This shocking twist didn't just question Richard's past, it threatened the entire royal story. A dynasty built on a lie? The revelation that Richard III's Y chromosome didn't match his supposed relatives sent a tidal wave of intrigue through the historical community. While his identity was confirmed through his mother's side, his father's side had just revealed a major fault line running through the royal family tree. The question was no longer if a scandal happened, but when and where. You see, the Y chromosome test involved descendants of Edward III, a king who ruled over a century before Richard. This meant the break in the genetic chain could have happened at any point in the generations between them. There were so many possibilities, and each one carried dramatically different consequences for history. If the false paternity event happened early on, perhaps with one of Edward III's own sons, it would mean that the entire claim of the later Plantagenet kings, including Richard, was based on a lie. They wouldn't have been the true biological heirs they claimed to be. On the other hand, what if the break happened much later in the family line of the living relatives who were tested? In that case, Richard's lineage might be perfectly legitimate, but theirs would be in question. The thing nobody tells you is how critical bloodline was to a monarch. Their entire right to rule, their divine authority, was based on an unbroken chain of succession from father to son. The most shocking fact is that a single instance of infidelity could, in theory, delegitimize an entire dynasty. This discovery adds a thick layer of irony to the Wars of the Roses. That entire 30-year conflict, which saw families torn apart and thousands of lives lost, was fought over who had the more legitimate claim to the throne. The House of York, Richard's family, and the House of Lancaster both traced their ancestry back to Edward III. They spilled rivers of blood arguing over who was the rightful heir. And now, 5 centuries later, modern science suggests that the very idea of a pure, unbroken Plantagenet bloodline might have been a complete fantasy all along. They may have been fighting over a crown that, genetically speaking, neither of them had a perfect claim to. Historians began poring over old records and forgotten rumors, looking for clues. Suspicions fell on key figures like John of Gaunt, a powerful son of Edward III, whose descendants formed the House of Lancaster. Could the break have happened with him, or perhaps even with Richard's own father, Richard, Duke of York? Rumors had swirled even back in the 15th century that Richard's mother, Cecily Neville, had an affair while her husband was away at war. If Richard's father wasn't who he thought he was, then Richard III never had a true claim to the throne in the first place. The evidence of a secret was there in the DNA, but the specifics, the who, when, and where, remained tantalizingly out of reach, a ghost of a scandal haunting the pages of history. But the DNA wasn't the only thing the bones had to say about the king. A king's true face. While the world was buzzing about the royal scandal hidden in the king's genes, the skeleton itself kept whispering secrets that separated the myth from the man. The DNA revelation was shocking, sure, but it was only one piece of a much bigger story, one that forced historians to confront just how wrong centuries of legend had been. For those wondering if this was all some elaborate hoax or overblown media stunt, the truth lay right there in the bones. The physical evidence didn't just confirm his identity, it completely rewrote the story of who Richard III really was. Let's start with that infamous hunchback. Thanks to Shakespeare, the world saw Richard as a twisted, evil villain, his outer form mirroring his supposed inner corruption. But when scientists examined the spine, what they found was both fascinating and tragic. Yes, he had severe adolescent-onset scoliosis. His spine curved dramatically to the right, making one shoulder higher than the other and shortening his height by a few inches. But he wasn't the grotesque figure we were led to believe. His condition wouldn't have crippled him or stopped him from leading men into battle. In fact, his bones showed strong muscle attachments, signs of an active, physically capable fighter. What had once been used as proof of wickedness turned out to be nothing more than a medical condition. His enemies hadn't just killed him, they'd twisted his body into a metaphor for evil. Then there was the chemical diary hidden in his bones and teeth. Through isotopic analysis, scientists traced where he lived, what he ate, and even how much he drank. The findings were astonishing. As a child, Richard had moved around England, reflecting his family's shifting fortunes during the Wars of the Roses. But once he reached the throne, his diet transformed. He lived like only a king could. His meals were filled with luxury meats, swan, crane, venison, and the isotopes revealed he was consuming a staggering amount of alcohol. Based on the carbon and nitrogen ratios, researchers estimated he was drinking about a bottle of wine every single day in his final years. That detail alone didn't just tell us about royal excess, it proved this was a man at the top of society, living the kind of opulent life only a crowned ruler could afford. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came from his face. Using a 3D scan of the skull, forensic artists rebuilt it piece by piece, layering on digital muscles, skin, and expression until a face emerged from history. What appeared wasn't the sneering monster immortalized on stage, but a composed, intelligent man with a faintly weary expression. The resemblance to early portraits of Richard III was uncanny, almost eerie. And when the DNA data was added, the image became even clearer. He likely had blue eyes and, as a child, light blonde hair that darkened with age. For the first time in 500 years, people could look into the eyes of a king long vilified as a murderer and see not a caricature but a real human being. Then came the most brutal revelation of all, how he died. The bones recorded every moment of his final battle at Bosworth Field in 1485 when he faced the forces of Henry Tudor. There were 11 wounds on his skeleton, 9 of them on the head. 2 were instantly fatal. One blow sliced away part of his skull, another drove a blade deep into the base of it, likely killing him instantly. His helmet had been torn off, leaving him exposed. The rest of the injuries suggested he was surrounded, fighting on foot, and struck down in a chaotic melee. After death, humiliation followed. His body was stripped, possibly thrown over a horse, and later buried hastily under what became a parking lot in Leicester. And yet those bones, torn, broken, and buried in silence, told a story more powerful than any myth. They revealed a man who fought to the very end, not the cowardly tyrant of legend, but a warrior king betrayed by fortune. The victors may have written the history, but the bones wrote the truth. This incredible discovery forces us to ask, if the royal bloodline itself is based on a secret, does it change who has the right to rule? Let us know your thoughts below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.